You know, as you've kind of been with us, if you have been with us over the last kind of couple of weeks or so, you know that we've actually started this sermon series in the book of Ruth. And for some of you who may be Christians, or if you're not a Christian here, welcome. We're so glad you're here. One of the unique things about the story of the scriptures, as Christians, we believe in kind of the scriptures and what they mean, is basically that the scriptures are actually comprised of 66 books. And so they're all different genres like poetry and letters and narrative and stories. And so there are stories like this, like the story of the book of Ruth, which is a story of this Ruth person named who's a Moabite. She's a foreigner. She's an immigrant. And she's actually the daughter-in-law of this woman named Naomi. And that was the story that we kind of talked about last week. And one of the things that we've been exploring is how interesting and fascinating it is how many of the stories, the narratives that we find in scriptures are really the story of many of us, the difficulties that we find ourselves in. And one of the things that we've been talking about in the book of Ruth is the story of redemption and how in all of these unexpected ways, redemption comes for Ruth, Naomi, and for their lineage, and which is really kind of surprising when one considers the story. And today we're really going to look at this story from the angle of how redemption comes through the faithfulness of someone like Ruth. Now, before we get into that, though, just to give you a backdrop of what happened last week as we were looking in Ruth chapter 1, there's a story of this woman named Naomi, and again, in the ancient world, names meant a whole lot. In fact, the names that are revealed when these narratives are told, these names actually reveal all sorts of kind of truths behind what's happening in the story. The name Naomi means this word pleasant. Now, Naomi is married to this guy named Elimelech. Can I hear you say Elimelech? That's right. Elimelech is someone, his name means God is king. Now, God is king. Elimelech is married to Naomi. There's a famine in the land in Bethlehem. And so as a result, they take their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they're forced to go to this place called Moab, which is a foreign territory. Now, it's in that place of Moab that Naomi, who's pleasant, her sons Mahlon and Chilion end up meeting two women, and they get married. So their daughters-in-law then are married to Moabite women, one of which is Ruth, the other is Orpah. Now, Elimelech, the story tells us in Ruth chapter 1, Elimelech dies. Now, there's all sorts of imagery here because Elimelech, again, his name is God is king. So if you can imagine, in the ancient world for a woman, the only kind of social capital that a woman had was actually to be married to a man, and the man and kind of the way that the woman kind of worked in conjunction with the man. I know that in many ways in today's culture it seems very archaic, and in that culture though, for a woman, the only kind of social capital or clout that they had was through her husband. And so Elimelech, whose name is God is king, has died. But not only that, Mahlon and Chilion, and again, those words, the names, scholars debate whether those were really the names of the sons, because Mahlon means sickness or infirmity, and Chilion means death or destruction. And so these two boys then, Mahlon and Chilion, they both die as well. And all Naomi is left with, and this was chapter 1, she leaves Bethlehem with her husband and her two sons. She comes back at the end of chapter 1, and she says, because news comes that in Bethlehem now, there's food now, the famine is over. So she comes back. She left full with her husband and her two boys. And she comes back, and she says to the people, don't call me Naomi anymore. Don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara. Call me bitter, because the Lord has afflicted me. He's forgotten me. And it says that she comes back with Ruth, a Moabite, a foreign woman, as her daughter-in-law. Now, so the drama of this story is basically, here's this woman, Naomi, who's had misfortune upon her, to the point where she comes back and she's like, hey, don't call me pleasant anymore. Call me Mara. Call me bitter. I've left full, and I've come back with nothing really. And what's accentuated is all I've come back with is this daughter-in-law named Ruth, who's actually a Moabite. So basically in the kind of the social structure and the strata, as they go back to Bethlehem, they are at the bottom of the totem pole. She is a widow, and she's brought back her daughter-in-law, who's also a widow. They have no way of making ends meet. And we come to this story then of where it seems like they are desperate. They are at the end of the road. There comes this moment where chapter 2 begins to tell the story of this woman Ruth and what she does. Now check this out. This is what it says. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite, now notice, time and time again throughout this story, it says Ruth the Moabite. It's stressed, it's accentuated. Why is that? Because again, foreigners had no kind of clout. Ruth is this outsider in this story. And so time and time again, the storyteller tells us, it's Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. In other words, this is what Ruth is basically saying. She's saying, we're hungry, we're desperate, we have nothing. Let me do this, to go to some fields. After people have picked the grain and whatever they need for sustenance, let me go. Because we are the poorest of the poor. We have nothing that we can hold on to. Therefore, let me do this. Now look at what Naomi says. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. Of course. Why not? This is our only chance of survival. Now again, coming from an immigrant background that I came from, like my parents who were in a foreign land and working so hard just to make ends meet. There were no options. The hustle in it, there were no options. And in many ways, this is the same predicament that Ruth and Naomi are in. They've got to do whatever they can to survive. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Now, look at what Ruth does, if we go to the next slide. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. So again, you get these hints of Ruth who's working tirelessly to make ends meet. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her the fortunes of this. This is amazing. Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. And this is what Ruth says. Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz, she said. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. So there's almost it's like this small sliver of hope. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Now, this clue is given to us, and it'll come to light over the next couple of weeks. Then Ruth the Moabite said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Now, what's so interesting about this moment, because if you can imagine for Naomi, her journey has been one of tragedy and sorrow. I mean, she says, call me Mara, call me bitter, because I was once pleasant, I was once full, but now I have nothing. And even chapter 1 ends on this note of like, how in the world are Naomi and Ruth going to make it? I mean, these two women, they're both widows. They've got no social clout. How in the world will they make it? And of course, Ruth is the one who's this Moabite, who's this foreigner who says, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do whatever I can to make ends meet. And so she goes into the fields. After people have kind of finished picking the grains, she goes just so that they would have enough food to eat. Now, there is this extraordinary story because in that moment, and one of the things that I mentioned last week was in the book of Ruth, the name of our God himself is not talked about a whole lot. In fact, the only time God is mentioned or the Lord is mentioned, it's when people are talking about God. But throughout the book of Ruth, one of the unique kind of storytelling that's happening throughout this story is that God is actually present throughout it. Now, if you can imagine for Naomi, though, I mean, she says, God has afflicted me. The Lord has afflicted me. God has left me. He's nowhere to be seen. He's forgotten me. All he's left me with is really nothing. A daughter-in-law who's been faithful to me, but of course she's a Moabite woman. There's no way God remembers me, that he's with me. And yet, what's so astounding about this story is that Ruth, who chooses to go out and to continue to at least make a living for her and her family, God is actually working and providing. And what it reveals to us is this, is that we are actually seen. God actually sees us, even when we may not be aware of it or we may not even know it. I think for many of us, I think when we get into seasons of difficulty, of trial, of trauma. I know that my initial propensity is to shake my fist at God and say, God, where are you? You don't see me. You don't notice my plight. And yet what's happening in this story, as we're examining the story of Naomi and Ruth, and notice, it's not like all of a sudden, even the story that we read, it's not like Ruth and Naomi are suddenly given like, oh, God sees you and now you're going to be made princess and queen of the land. You know, you've got all sorts of health and wealth. No, they're still poor. They're still at the bottom of the barrel. They're still in a lot of pain and shame and difficulty. And yet, the subtext of the story is that God actually sees everything that's happening, even when we may not be aware of it, even when we may not know it. And the same is true for you, and the same is true for me. Because my propensity is to think that God has forgotten me. God, where are you? And yet, God sees everything. He sees us to the point where Boaz notices who Ruth is. And Boaz actually allows Ruth to glean in the fields because he notices. And this word notice, this idea of being seen, this is a reality for what's happening for Ruth and for Naomi. I have this weird kind of habit when our kids, my son is 7, my son David's 7, and my daughter is 4, Avery. And, as they grow up, like usually they're really attached, and then kind of as they grow up, they get used to being with other people and being in other social settings. And one of the things that I kind of like to do as they get older and as they get used to being on the playground and playing with others, sometimes what I'll do, especially kind of if we're in this field, I'll notice like I'll unleash them to the playground and they'll be jumping around and they've got so much like confidence and moxie to them, especially my daughter Avery, who's 4 years old. She just has this sass about her, and she's just kind of running around. And sometimes what I'll do now, please don't judge me for this, but what I'll do is like I'll kind of like hide around one of the jungle gyms, the apparatus, and I'll just kind of hide because it leads to what is one of my favorite moments. And it's basically like, my daughter and my son are playing with such gusto and such confidence. And there comes this moment of like when they notice that I might be gone. And so it's just like this crestfallen, just like they go from being like these confident New Yorkers, right, who are like just out here, they own the playground. And then all of a sudden, like there's this moment where they wonder where I am, and they're just basically like all of a sudden they become crestfallen, as if they're from New Jersey. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry, that was kind of mean. No, but they become like all of a sudden they lose this chutzpah, and like this blank feeling of terror and anxiety comes over them. And one of my favorite moments, and this is why I love doing it, like I'll just kind of like I'll peek around the apparatus. I'm like, David, Avery, I'm right here. and David, and all of a sudden, like once they know that I see them, that I'm with them, like everything changes again. They can go back to, running around with confidence and chutzpah. And I was thinking that for many of us, I think there are these moments, especially in difficult moments, especially in moments of trial and fear and anxiety, and maybe even in your life today, there are these moments where we wonder whether God sees us and we feel like maybe he's absent, and maybe we've lost some of our mojo because there's this feeling of, God, have you left me? And I imagine for someone like Naomi and for Ruth, I mean, those are the questions that they're wrestling with. God, my husband's name is Alima, like God is king. Sure doesn't look like you're king, though. Sure looks like you don't see me, you don't notice me. And yet woven through this story in chapter 2 where Boaz notices, and there's Ruth who's going about doing what immigrants and what foreigners do just to make ends meet. There's this revelation. God actually does see. God is aware, even when you may not know it. And the question is, for you and for me, are we aware that maybe God does see, that he is aware, that he is present, and he's doing something mysterious? Now, again, it's not like Ruth and Naomi all of a sudden in this story, like they've become this wealthy princess and queen. No. But the story emerges where it's the story of God who's moving and working behind. He does see, even when you may not know it. See, but what's our part in this? And this is what this story is really about. Because it's a story of God noticing and God intervening and his redemption coming. But notice what Ruth's part is in this. If we go back to the story, because Ruth, of course, she goes out and she's simply trying to make ends meet, doing what she can for her family. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? Who is this woman who's coming up behind everyone else and picking up the leftovers? The overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So in other words, here Ruth has made herself available in terms of her quiet faithfulness, going about her task. And so Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. See, because Boaz notices Ruth. Don't go and glean in another field and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me a foreigner? Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. So in other words, this is what Boaz basically says. Ruth, stories about you have been circulating. Stories of your faithfulness to Naomi. Stories about your friendship to your mother-in-law. Stories about how you were a Moabite, but yet you made this sacrifice to come and to serve and to love your mother-in-law and to live here. And the fact that you've been here working day and night to try to serve your mother-in-law. Because of that, I give you this grace, and because of that, I'm going to give you my protection. This is what Boaz is essentially saying. Now, isn't this extraordinary? It's basically Ruth has taken these steps. Because here's what Ruth could have done. When Ruth and Naomi go back to being in Bethlehem, here's what they could have done. They could have just said, woe is me. This is the worst time to live. Maybe I should just give up on life. I mean, so much of me, that's kind of my propensity when things are going bad. But here's what Ruth does. She gets up and she does what's needed for the sake of herself as well as the sake of Naomi. She gets up and she continues to live with quiet faithfulness. And here's what's revealed about what Ruth does. See, the reason why Boaz notices Ruth is because it's quiet faithfulness, really, that is seen and ultimately rewarded. What it's revealing is, do you see, it's Ruth who actually takes the steps to be faithful, to not give up, to not kind of let go of life, and to not lay down and just say, woe is me, let me wither and die here. But instead, it's the act of quiet obedience and faithfulness, of getting up in the morning, of going about what she's called to do. That's what's noticed by Boaz. And that's what's ultimately rewarded. And this theme of quiet faithfulness, of perseverance, that's what's actually seen and ultimately rewarded. Now, here's the thing. I think in today's world, especially the social media saturated world, there's this belief that somehow in a day, things will just be handed to me and things will radically change. And so this idea of perseverance and faithfulness can be tougher to come by. I've heard it said that oftentimes in social media, we compare everyone else's highlight reel to our mundane day-to-day reality. And in fact, research has shown that those people who the more one kind of gets addicted to social media, one starts to get more and more depressed. And I believe it's because so many of us, we compare ourselves. We're like, wow, that person eats a great meal every single time. And I'm just eating peanut butter and jelly. Or, wow, that person goes on vacations all the time. I hate them. But isn't this true? Isn't this what we do? We essentially, we compare everyone else's highlight reel to our mundane, day-to-day living. And the reality is faithfulness. Faithfulness is actually super underrated, of this idea of continuing to be faithful, especially when things are difficult. Because in our world today, we want instant fixes, we want instant change, instant gratification. But yet, in the story of Ruth, what we find, and again, it's not like Ruth, life automatically changes by meeting Boaz. No, she gets this grace, but it's because of her quiet faithfulness that she's noticed in this regard. And this is a grace that Boaz gives to her. A lot of the questions that I often get about calling and life, and whether you're religious or not, there's this question of like, what should I do for the rest of my life? Some people, they ask this question. When they ask this question, they're asking, what kind of career should I have? So for instance, like, am I really called to be a pharmacist? Sorry, that was just a random. The answer is no, you're not called to be a pharmacist. No, I'm just kidding. That's when we think about calling, we think about it in terms of career and whether I'm called to be a pharmacist or called to finance or called to whatever else it might be. There's actually a book by a theologian and an author by the name of Jerry Sitzer. And Jerry Sitzer actually wrote a book called The Will of God as a Way of Life. Now, Jerry Sitzer, one of the books that he also wrote was a book called A Grace Disguised, and one of the seminal moments in his life was when his family was in a car accident and he lost his children, his wife, as well as some in-laws. So immediately he lost these different generations in one car accident. He writes a lot about grief and loss and life and the spiritual journey. And Jerry Sitzer, in his book on this idea of the will of God as a way of life, one of the things he talks about is oftentimes when it comes to the will of God, we think of these meta questions of, the meta question of what am I supposed to do in terms of my career? And one of the things he talks about in terms of following God, oftentimes following God is a big mystery. But perhaps the will of God for you and for me, and the way that we're to approach how to find his will, is to really see it as a way of life. It's to see it as a life of faithfulness, to see it as a life of, I will choose to live a life of integrity even when life is hard and difficult. To having integrity with my words, to having integrity with my body, to having integrity with my money and possessions. I will choose to live a life of humility even when life is difficult. I will live a life of loving my enemies and trying to be forgiving and doing my best to honor God in every circumstance. See, it's this faithfulness thing that is often so underrated because we want the meta questions answered. We want the highlight reel. And how does that highlight reel come? And here's what I'd like to suggest to you, that often it comes through your quiet faithfulness, through my quiet faithfulness. But one of the difficult things is it's really hard to be faithful when life feels like it's in the dumps. When you're in a situation where you've been battling an illness, or when you know someone who's been battling an illness, and you're asking God, why have you afflicted me or this person that I love? And you're wondering what it means to be faithful. Maybe you're going through a season as a single person. You're trying to live with integrity as a single person, and you're not just trying to date around and do what everyone else is doing, but instead you're trying to do it with faithfulness. And meanwhile, you've been waiting on God, asking God, when are you going to come through? Or maybe as a parent, you've gone through a difficult season, and you're wondering, you're doing your best, you're calling out to God, you're wondering when God will move in the life of your child, and you're desperate for it, and the last thing on your mind is being faithful. Have you ever been there before? I know that if you're anything like me, I know that I have such a difficult time being faithful, especially when things get hard. I think back earlier or in 2019, at the beginning of 2019, Tina, my wife, she went through a pretty significant medical condition that she was rushed to the ER, had 3 emergency surgeries. It was an incredibly difficult time. And honestly, during that season, the last thing I wanted to do was to pray to God and try to stay faithful to what he's called me to. I just wanted to give up on life. And I was wondering, God, where are you in the midst of this? Because that's what difficulty does. You know, I came across this graphic from a friend of mine, and I know it's a little bit hard to read, but it's actually this graphic. And again, the reason why I love this graphic, because I think it describes so many of us in our journeys, and I think it describes life itself, but if you check out the header, it basically says this: the emotional journey of creating anything great. That's the title of this. If you want to look it up, I think you can Google it on your phones, and because it's hard to read. But look, kind of at the beginning of the journey, it basically says, "This is the best idea ever." Have you ever been there where you feel like, oh, this will be great. This new job is going to be awesome. And then you go to that new job, and then you get to the second point where it's like, whoa, this will be fun. And then number 3, it's like, this is harder than I thought. And slowly, whenever you've been trying to walk yourself into kind of this new season of life, you realize, wow, this is much more difficult than I thought. Now, what's interesting about this whole graph is at the bottom of it, it says it's the dark swamp of despair. You see that black part at the bottom? The dark swamp of despair, and there's this bridge. If you can make it across this bridge, not reach the dark swamp, but if you can make it across the bridge, and the bridge basically says belief or perseverance, and it says family or humor. That the way that we make it, and this goes back to last week's theme of friendship, of making it through the dark kind of swamp of despair, if we can make it across that bridge, then we can make it. And then eventually what happens is we start getting on this upward slope. Wow, this is more rewarding than I thought. And then you keep going up and up and up. Now, the reason why I love this graphic is because, this so describes life. My journey, your journey, all of our journeys, except for those of you who post on Instagram all your favorite foods and stuff like that. It doesn't describe you, okay? It describes the rest of us. Describes how life really is this roller coaster journey. And sometimes we get lost in these moments of incredible despair. And the question for you and the question for me is, will you and will we stay faithful, especially when it's hard? For Ruth, she's someone who does not give up hope, but she continues to stay faithful. And this faithfulness is eventually rewarded. Now, we're not even getting to the end of the story. We're just getting to the part where Boaz is actually noticing Ruth. But for Ruth, she's quietly faithful. And it's in that faithfulness that she's seen and ultimately rewarded. The question for you and the question for me is, are we the types who are also going to be faithful in the midst of difficulty, of trial, of pain? Dave Gibbons, who's a mentor of mine, he was telling a group of us, he said to us this, he said, winter often lasts for a season, but springtime comes in one day. So everyone, welcome to spring today. I know it's very warm. It's very warm in here. But isn't this true, right? Like if we can remain faithful, springtime and breakthrough. And what if I could tell you that faithfulness, if you are faithful, breakthrough is coming. But the question is, will you be faithful in the moments of the swamp of despair? Will you remain clinging and tethered to God and his ways and who he's called you to be? Especially in those moments of despair and difficulty. Will you trust him? Will you remain faithful? Will you cling to him? Because winter may last for a season, but springtime can come in one day. So many of us, I know that for me, my initial impulse is to eject on God. God, I don't trust what you're doing. In fact, I think you're doing everything wrong. Let me do it my way. And yet, the invitation for us is to remain faithful and to believe that when we're faithful, we will be ultimately rewarded. And that whatever season that you might find yourself in today, if you're going through some financial difficulties and there's every kind of temptation to cut corners, or maybe you're going through a season at work where you feel like your integrity is being compromised and there's every part of you that just simply wants to do that as well. And today the call is faithfulness. Will you stay quietly faithful even when it's difficult, believing that it will be ultimately rewarded? Now, here's the thing. You might be like, okay, Drew, thanks. It's hard right now. And some of us maybe you're in that season of trying to remain faithful. It's hard right now, but I've been disappointed so often. You're basically giving me this talk about being faithful. You have no idea what I'm going through. And you're telling me to be like Ruth. Well, actually, here's the uniqueness of the Christian story. See, the uniqueness of the Christian story is the hero is actually not Ruth. And as wonderful and as amazing as the fact is that Ruth, the Moabite, is the one who gives deliverance. You see, the story, the Christian story, is a story of God himself, who even before he would ask us to be faithful, he himself would be exceptionally faithful to us. He would send Jesus, his son, in the midst of our world, our broken, fallen world. He would send Jesus, his son, to live and die on our behalf, to remain faithful even to the point of death, even to the point of going into the despair. Why? So that we would trust and know that there's a God who is for us and is committed to us. But of course, this Jesus would also resurrect from the grave to demonstrate to you and to me that there's no amount of difficulty that is insurmountable in the story of God. And so this is why, and we talked about this in the previous series, how in the world did the early church grow? Centuries of persecution, and the church basically grew exponentially from this small bandit of nobodies to becoming this worldwide movement that would change the face of the world, that we sit here today because somehow these Christians believed in the power of the story of Jesus. How in the world did that happen? It was because they believed that they could be faithful in the face of bloodshed, in the face of torture, in the face of pain, in the face of whatever worries might befall us. In fact, the author of Hebrews puts it this way. Look at what the author of Hebrews says. In the middle, it says, let us run with perseverance. There's that word of faithfulness. The race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him. Will you trust him? Will you believe in him? You see, don't you see? You see, this is not a story, and Christianity is not a religion that says, see, get better, get stronger, be more persevering, be more faithful. No, it's a story of a people who have somehow been able to lift our heads to see the author and perfecter of our faith, the one who has come to live and die on our behalf, and to trust him and to see his name and story, and to believe him that he says that even in our darkest moments, we can have faith and hope and life and love. And as a result, we can be quietly faithful, knowing that our ultimate reward is experiencing the fullness of what God might have for us. Will you trust him? Will you be faithful today? Will you lift your heads, consider the one who lived and died on your behalf? And will you trust that you can get through whatever you're getting through because of him and what he has done?